What is going on, everybody? Thanks for joining tonight. This is SCPCRNP, aka Lack of Lepers, and I want to welcome you to our Thursday night reaction series stream. Thank you for joining. Hope you've had a nice week so far. Do want to remind you that we're only going to be doing this on Tuesdays and Thursdays from here on out. But tomorrow night, of course, Friday night, always exciting. We look forward to our weekly coverage of the SCP articles that have come out this week, and it's been an interesting week. Let's call it that. So do not miss that. That'll be about 3 hours. That'll take place at the same time. This is 7:30 p.m. CST. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We were about 30 minutes into this, which is an interview with S D Locke from the So You Think You Can Fanon cast and crew. So let's get back to where we was, because I talked a lot last episode. Had a lot to say though, so and we're going to do this format right here because there's not a lot going on. Not a lot going on the screen here. Okay, let's get into it. Boom.
Special containment procedures should be somebody into reading the rest of the article, like you have the same pay attention to in terms of like pacing and atmosphere, depending on. I'd say overall it's really similar. It's just a matter of
how y'all doing tonight?
Breaking it into a defined style of formatting.
Interesting. And how would you then say, like, how would you compare like an SCP tale to, how you're usually writing SCPs? Like,
a little bit of overlap.
What is the differences there? What are some of the like paths that you take specifically to make it fit within SCP, but also to kind of not just be like another piece of fan fiction?
I'm honestly not even really. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank.
Yep.
Fair.
That's a question.
Difficult.
To be fair, that was a very tough question.
I was, just throwing it out there.
It sort of meandered. Sort of like a scatter shotgun shell shot of a question where it's like there wasn't one point of aim. It was kind of tough question.
But getting back to the writing, like if you were to write one of your older SCPs today, how would you rewrite? Like what would you change about it specifically?
I really should do a lot of rewriting on my proposal. I think it's I didn't things that are kind of in the background that I don't really flesh out or address enough, like because it's supposed to be kind of like right now it's just sort of like vague, like a bad codependent, just kind of in the background, and it's
the audio's flipping around so much it's like a fish out of water. I'm not sure what was said there, but that's interesting, because that article's doing very well. So once again, I respect Locke. Locke is not going to let something like a massive rating of like plus 2,000 stop Locke from thinking about these kinds of things, like how could I improve it a little bit. Not that the question was asked of me, but if I could go back, I would put all of my ratings at the top of the page, that thing that has to be there, in a collapsible. So that's what I did on all my work since SCP. Everything I've done, RPC, there's one article on Liminal Archive, but mainly on RPC. Any article of mine has the rating in the top right corner. It's actually over here, in a collapsible. I would go back and do that with every single one of my articles immediately, but I can't. So that's a bummer.
I think bringing it more to the fore would give full bodiness, a little bit more strength to it.
He said, Locke said full-bodied. I love that. I love that descriptor. Full-bodied is kind of a wine term, like a full-bodied wine. I'm going to use that. That's really good. Thank you for that. Wow.
All right. How many ideas for SCPs do you have floating around in your head?
Too many. I actually just got one last night, or not the night before, and I tried, like, oh man, I'm so terrible. I tried to write it because I thought it'd be really cool. Like, hey, it'd be really awesome. I got a sneak peek or something. I haven't used it yet, but like, so I got this really good idea, mainly because
Oh damn.
Mainly because what?
Yeah, and it was just mainly just a scene that kind of played out, something just really creepy. And I tried to start something up kind of like right towards that point of this little nightmare that I had, and I wasn't able to let out. So it's just like I have like half a freaking article just sitting here, any of them.
Yo, Sam, I've got like 10 ideas for stories that I want to write.
Yeah, same. I started rough drafting my own article because I was just like, I have this idea. I'm surprised nobody did it. I'm gonna.
Oh, so one of these interviewers is active on the wiki. I wonder who it is. I'm looking at the names up here, and I don't really see who this could be. I would like to know that, who this person is on the wiki. Speaking. The person speaking is not Locke. The person speaking is one of the interviewers. So I wonder who that is.
To do it because I know this stuff pretty well, and I just sat there. I'm like, I don't want this to just become, oh, it's that thing, but now as an SCP, because like there's a lot of that just like sort of twists on just classic horror. Like I can't really think of a good example right now. I guess probably the best one would just be like the I forget the SCP number, but it's the
kind of a sleepy interview, isn't it? You could almost take naps between I don't know, questions, answers.
It's like the red hounds that are able to speak in different, like as different people.
It's 939.
939.
939.
Like that one's like kind of gives me the vibes of like alien, like xenomorph, just based on like how it's described and like how it kind of operates.
Hey, take that, D. Sherm. The first, the first result on Google for 939 is the rubber. Oh boy, probably pissed off about that. But the next one is the actual wiki. That's nice. A lot of the times it's just a bunch of drudgery that you have to get through before you actually get a link to the wiki. The most common thing sort of upsetting the order besides YouTube videos is fandom. There it is right there. Fandom. Ugh. Dude. No, man. They put a picture in from some video game, I guess. Bad. What a great song, by the way. My favorite song on our mix. I wish it lasted a little longer. So nice. So pretty. So pretty. You know, just before we get started again, just because it's just you and me. What's up? I came across a very old piece of music. Like you may have heard me say this before, but I've written music since I was 18 years old. I'm 35, and I've been writing since I was 18. And so I have like, I can't remember the number, but it's like 10 gigabytes worth of songs in zipped form. So they're all the albums that I've done are zipped, and it's about 10 gigabytes. So it's a lot of music. And the last song I wrote, I've taken kind of a hiatus from that, was about a year ago, and I stumbled upon it. So, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, I remember this. It's just something that I put together about this time last year and didn't really do it a lot with. So maybe we'll listen to that, huh? You and I. Just cause. Maybe we'll do that.
I thought that was interesting, but like it's not the xenomorphs. It's its own beast.
Yeah, no, I feel that. Like taking certain inspiration from like horror things I really enjoy, and then trying to SCP treatment, which I did with
or like basically what that sounds like to me is make them better. So like nothing against a xenomorph, but like what is it really? I mean, it's an I'm gonna kill you monster with a slightly novel method of reproduction and procreation, if you want to call it that. So I mean, you know, that's one of the reasons I got into SCP. That's one of the reasons why like I'm so upset at you know, authors taking the genre in the wrong direction, is because, you know, when you make decisions that mimic things like Hollywood scripts and Hollywood characters and Hollywood dialogue and all these things that really are antithetical to why the SCP was created in the first place, you know, that's a bother to me. So like these authors are constantly making the art form more like the context that the initial people starting the SCP Wiki were trying to escape, were trying to get away from. You know, and part of that, for example, are like Hollywood movies. Like Hollywood scary movies are terrible. I mean, they're all very bad. generationally, you'll get one that's good. Like, I'm going to say The Ring. I'm going to say Blair Witch. It's not common that you get a Hollywood scary movie that's good. They're basically all the same. And they're basically just, manufacturing processing plant, content farm kind of stuff. They're all very similar. They all suffer from the same ailments. And so that's really why I was so excited to see the SCP Wiki, is because it's like, okay, somebody's actually doing horror in a fresh way, like a engaging, exciting, interesting, non-formulaic fashion. And so anyway, that's my rant for that. Just hate to see the genre devolve back into what it was initially supposed to escape and be better than.
One recent one I did this year was if you've ever watched The Thing.
I think we have talked about just like kind of the SCP Wiki and some of the ones we were like, oh,
hold on.
It gives me the vibes of like Alien, like Xenomorph.
Okay, so I don't know if it was this thing with this podcast where the audio keeps cutting out, and like excises snippets of what we would hear as to be like answers. But there's this moment that just happened where Locke was like, yeah, I wrote this recent article. I don't know if you know of like The Thing ... And then no one says anything. Like they just move right on. Listen for that.
Just based on like how it's described and like how it kind of
awkward.
Operates. I thought that was interesting. But like it's not just like it's not the xenomorphs. It's its own beast.
Yeah, no, I feel that.
Here we go. Hold on.
Taking certain inspiration from like horror things I really enjoy, and then trying to SCP treatment, which I did with one recent one I did this year was if you've ever watched The Thing.
I think we have talked about just like kind of the SCP Wiki and some of the ones we were like, oh, that's so cool. But like, is there any SCP?
Hey, you guys ever watch The Thing? So we're gonna move on to a different question now.
SCPs in particular that you are just like anytime you are asked.
Let's chuck that up to the audio being broken. My God.
For recommendations, you just immediately point to and go, "This is the one."
Far too many to list in this single podcast. Probably, I actually as like sort of a quality of life improvement for the site, I created this page sidebar now. And it's basically sort of like a Hall of Fame / best of compilation of like
So Locke is talking about this user curated, handpicked Nightmare Fuel. I think Locke still does this. I think. Let's look at the history. But this is a nice. If this is a great tool. If you really want, Locke is still doing decent work here. Uncle Nicolini decided to leave a strange note on this page most recently, but before that it looks like it's Dr. Peeper. That's funny. It's mainly Locke who did this, I think, or took over it. Must have taken over it. No, Locke's been there for a long time. So anyway, what Locke was trying to say before the audio of the podcast cut out was that Locke has helped and done a large portion of the work curating these lists, and so you can go into this. It shows 100 horror SCPs, 100 sci-fi SCPs, comedy SCPs, other sort of theme-centric selections. And so, Locke has incredibly good taste. So, in my opinion, this is a great way to really hone in on some good works. This page is kind of like if you took what we do on Friday nights and just applied it to themes across the whole wiki. So and Locke is, like Locke said, Locke has been here for a long time. So this is somebody's recommendations that mean a lot. They're not trivial.
SCPs broken up by genre. So for horror alone, I just added another same, then we got sci-fi, comedy. So pretty much far too many for me to recommend at once.
Deal.
At least we now know where to go look for the ones that you particularly looking for. Are there any, you don't have to name them in particular, but like, is there any SCPs that you just like don't like whatsoever?
Oh goodness.
I
Probably a
mean,
few.
man, you can't answer that question on a podcast like this. This podcast is essentially PG when it comes to the space. Like Locke is too smart for that. I don't know if that was like a trap question or something, but like a bait question. But you don't answer that question. Locke is too smart to answer that question. You're not gonna call out one person's bad article on a podcast like this. You can do it like on my show, no problem. But on a family friendly, podcast like this, no.
Most of the time, because like I've read far too many of these to like actually remember. So like if I don't like it, most of the time it's not even gonna ever again.
It's a good answer.
Sorry, Matt.
I mean,
Titty Monster is a
it's not that the
no-go.
titty monster is bad.
Aw,
It's just
damn.
cursed.
That shit sucks.
More jumping around
Oh,
in the
yeah,
audio.
Of all the SCPs I've read, I don't think any of them really come close to being as just physically unsettling as the tit monster. There's just something very, very cosmically unsettling about it.
Yeah, I agree.
It's not even like a dangerous one. That's the funny thing.
Most really disturbing SCPs aren't dangerous. This is really like 101. It's not 101. Maybe it's like 110. When it comes to writing in the genre, it's that there is no correlation between how spooky and how dangerous and how threatening the anomaly is with its effect. Those two things they're disconnected. And if anything, if there's any relationship between them, it's inverse, such that it's almost when you write the safer things that they become more disturbing, because these things, when they're safe, they should be pretty innocuous. They should be pretty benign. You should be able to put them in a box, as the Bach test would have you do, and leave it alone, and you should be fine. Everybody should be fine if it's safe class. And so for a safe class article, the extra little bit of horror in being more restrained than this like world-ending Keter is that if something is going to go wrong, and if there is horror, and if there is, let's say, gore or something happening here, it's because somebody messed up the process of just keeping it in that safe box. So it really kind of puts the onus of the horror on the human component of the situation, as opposed to this like, cosmically sort of eldritch horror that can do whatever it wants to, and you're just a little ant. There's a much more human, much more intimate, much more immediate sort of horror that I think hits a little harder when you are able to achieve that with like a safe designation. So that's not really surprising for me to hear.
Yeah, that's an example of things that have been redacted really well.
Yeah, no.
What?
It's really, really cursed because it only redacts the scope of things, but you pretty much know exactly what's happening to those people.
I don't know what's happening in this podcast. There's too many sections cut out. I can't follow what they're talking about. I wish I knew.
It's unnerving and unsettling in the worst of ways. I think that's actually one of the SCPs I would never ever want to encounter in real life. Do you have one of those, Locke? An SCP that just, without question, you would never want to have to. You'd rather die to another SCP.
I'd rather die to another.
That's a good
SCP.
question, man.
I'd say probably that fucking. Was it 1004? The nobody needs that. That or there's another one. Was it 312? Is this it? Yeah, the fan fiction website that.
Yeah, so the 1004 is something we've already mentioned here. They mentioned it again. This is Admin Bright's piece. And then it sounds like Locke is about to mention that one that turns you into a furry.
I think it turns people into
Which one is
furries.
this? This seems like one we need to.
I think you just mean fur affinity.
Let's see, SCP
Was that-
furry.
I don't think we need to read it. We'll turn into furries.
Transform.
AKA, I'll just become furrier.
There it is.
That's not how it works, sir. I don't want to do that.
You'd be like furry squared.
Yeah. Do you know what happens when you become furry squared? Nothing good. Have you ever seen Midwest Fur Fest? At night,
Have you
I have
seen
to
the
spe-
brown-nosed pup? He should be a real life and
I don't want to think about that one either.
Up the shot, Phoenix. Up shut the fuck.
You don't.
This guy's got good laughs. I love it. Love to hear that.
Wang has a video on it if you're curious.
Yeah, this is the article they
Okay,
mentioned. They never mentioned it by name, but it's SCP-3312, which is really. It's really disturbing. It's not really about like ooh furries. It's not like trying to poke fun or shame furry, ism. But nonetheless, it does a really, really good job of making, what some people will regard as like a fantasy into something just viscerally horrific. So, good article.
Is there any? How about
Who wrote this?
Because you said that your first one was a GOI, right?
Yeah.
Dog teeth.
What are some of your favorite SCP canons or GOIs?
Say
You can at
cannons.
least name a few. Yeah, canons or GOIs.
Cannons would probably be the Geos canon, because that's kind of like what got me into. And I wish I could like actually.
GOC
go
is what he meant to.
the canon
What
page. They
Locke
changed
said.
the whole layout of the site. So Rat's Nest is real fun. That one is
I don't
like
know if I've heard of that.
reality's just falling the fuck apart,
Rat's
and is
Nest.
aware of like what the Foundation is.
Hub? Rat's Nest. Huh. Well, that is interesting. Oops. This is really interesting. Look at this. Let's begin at the end. Rat's Nest. Nice little visual here. I do not know this one very well. There's a lot of tales. Looks like a Series 6 SCP is in there. That's it. That's the only SCP that's in there. Wow. A lot of tale work in this. So there's no wonder I haven't read any of this, but I don't know if I know this one either. On-site housing. Individuals don't require sleep. Not too long either. Huh. Well, I had no idea about this hub. This is news to me. So, but I don't really read tales. I'm not going to lie. Don't really do that. All right. So let's get back to this because I accidentally clicked off of this page. Look at that.
I was following the
People in like another universe.
Dado.
try
I
to
was
free
following
minds
like
and shit
those
like that.
ones as they were coming out. I found those to be kind of interesting.
Yeah, Dado's pretty funny.
The he's the
Dado is a great character and just is a wonderful example of simplicity, being incredibly fertile despite it being thin conceptually. But Dado is dead. It's not the specific political direction that Dado was taken into. It's that Dado was taken into a specific political direction. No. Let me say that again. It was because Dado was taken into a general political direction, period. It doesn't matter what it is. Dado would be equally ruined if it was, a QAnon supporter, as Dado is ruined by it being all cops are bad, and that's where Dado has gone, and by its own creator, by its own creator's will. So, Dado is dead. Okay, Dado died sometime in 2020, I guess 2021, and the Dado articles that you see now are sort of like a necromancy that raises Dado from the dead and sort of puppets it to dance for really stupid things. Like one article we read recently on our show that was probably one of the worst articles that I've read on the SCP Wiki, certainly since I've been doing this article review series about Dado, and trying to take it in a more serious direction, sort of casting Dado in a more emotionally sympathetic light, giving Dado a lot of humanitarian momentum behind the character. I mean, it's just really, really sad to see what happened to Dado, because we're dealing with a set of authors, you can't escape it. It's decentralized, so how are you going to control it? But, we're dealing with a lot of people who don't know when to stop. And that's what happened with Dado. But at least the person who created Dado killed Dado as well, and it wasn't just left up to the pack to rip apart, and shred piece by piece, taking it away. At least it was the owner who took it out back and shot it in the head.
Gamers against weed guy, right?
No, he's not actually tied to gamers. I think it's probably.
I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did Dado and gamers against weed. That's just, once again, that's just the kind of stuff that you see these days. It's like, okay, so what can we put Dado with now? And it doesn't really do the character any justice. It misses the whole point of Dado. Looks like this is an article that not Dodo. Although Dado has gone the way of the Dodo. Dado inclusion. Yeah, so there's gamers against weed logs, Dado's inclusion. So this sounds like, I don't know this article. It sounds like it could just cast a bunch of GOIs together, including Dado, but that's probably going to happen. So, over under, how long is it going to take for us to see a Dado plus gamers against weed article on the wiki? Let's put the over under at 3 months. Start your bets.
Some crossovers somewhere,
Gotcha.
But he's not intrinsically tied to. He's just his own.
Gotcha. Because I don't know. Maybe something I was
himself.
reading, I was getting the two of them conflated with each other, but
Clearly,
both of those are interesting. Especially because we're kind of gamers here, so you think you could fan in. Nobody backs me up on that.
Ooh.
Just a bit. I wouldn't say that I'm full gamer mode. Yeah, I'm not backing you up on it. I'm just saying we're a little bit.
Dude.
Little gamer.
there are some really awkward moments in this podcast from the hosts.
We do a little gaming.
We do it.
I
We
mean,
do a
speaking
little
of
gaming
gaming,
in there, you know.
I mean, we talked about
No
SCP
problem.
containment breach, but I do have to ask. This is just a hypothetical. If you had, all the resources in the world to do, the perfect SCP game or movie or TV series, what would you make?
You would make Andre Duxon. Because that's what Andre Duxon was trying to do. Andre Duxon, if you don't know, was really pissed off that that you couldn't have distributive rights for SCP material. It's Creative Commons, so that basically means that any major studio, whether it's gaming or Hollywood or film or whatever, TV, they're never going to touch SCP. Which is brilliant. I mean, brilliant, because we all know what happens when those sorts of people get their hands on material, don't we? But, that means that you're never really going to have a super, super high budget, top level production, whether it be gaming or whether it be a film about the SCP. So if you're curious, if you don't know, that's why you're never going to get it. It's because the people who would be making that wouldn't have any control over who gets to sell it. They can't make any copyright claims. They can't claim any piracy. They can't enforce anything like that. So no one who's got a bunch of money is going to be interested in putting it into a project that they cannot control the distribution of. They can't really have any ownership or intellectual property control over. That's why you'll never see that. So that's what Andre Duxon decided to do. He was pissed off that nobody wanted to do it. In fact, the same thing happened in Russia, as has happened with the English branch several times in the early history, which is that some big studio, some big writer, some decent name came to somebody and was like, "Hey, I want to do a project on the SCP Wiki. Can y'all fashion this thing with me into a central canon so I can tell it as a narrative in a show?" And the answer is always no, because they finally get to the point in the conversation where it's like, okay, well, you can do this, but you can't control the distribution of your content. It won't be your intellectual property to claim or to enforce. And so they all ditch. That very thing happened in Russia, months before Duxon decided that he was going to go trademark the logo. So that's why he did it. is because they were on the precipice of this really impressive deal. Of course, he was hoping to make a lot of money. He was going to get a lot of that money. He was going to give some of it back to the administrators of the Russian branch, by the way. That was a deal that was done. But of course, the production team backed out once they finally understood, had the revelation of what this CC license meant for their project. They backed out. And so Duxon thought this was ridiculous. He wanted to make a bunch of money, and no one was going to do it. No, there's no money flow in. You can't do it. No one's going to do that with an appreciable amount of money. The only way you're going to get that is donations, which is what we see things like SCP Pandemic, this game. It's all donations. So.
That's tough. I think probably a game would afford like the most potential for like going throughout the universe. Like I think like with how much shit there is, like a movie.
I'm going to interrupt because I think that an SCP sort of anthology in the style and honor of something like Love, Death, and Robots would be pretty fucking cool. Pretty fucking cool. In fact, I hate to say this, but I'm a big fan of that show. Love, Death, and Robots. Everybody knows it. It's on Netflix. And the first season was miraculous. The second season was a severe letdown. I don't think there was a single good episode in that second season personally. And then this third season that's come out recently so far it's fucking fantastic. And I hate to say this, but they do the things that SCP wants to do better. They do what SCP tries to do better, in my opinion. This is a great example right here. Season 3, Episode 1, if you haven't checked this out. I didn't like this episode because the characters try to be like cutesy, sort of like... these characters really are sort of Neo-Law Foundation characters, where they try to be too cutesy, and the dialogue is all about like campy, plinky, Marvel tier, Star-Lord style discussion. But hey... For what it is, it's better than what SCP does. So I don't agree with this style of writing, but if we're gonna just operate in that style, I think that these people do it better. Great show. You should definitely go check it out. Excellent show. But yeah, I'd love to see Love, Death, and Robots just with SCPs.
So I think maybe something like if you ever played Control, which is basically
I've played a little
SCP,
bit of it.
the game.
Right.
Something.
Control. Yeah, it's a weird game, but yeah, that's fair.
I had an idea for a game. I mentioned it on like our very first SCP.
So I can already tell you the idea for the game is not going to be very good, because if it was, you wouldn't be sharing it on your podcast, just like for somebody else to pick up before you finish it. You don't want to Dr. Magnus yourself. You don't want to Dr. Magnus yourself with the Great Seal. Don't want to do that.
Episode where my idea for the game would be kind of like a 4-person like co-op type deal. You're a mobile task force, and like there would be different like game modes. Like you'd have like object retrievals, or you'd have like.
Hey, you know what? I think Locke should have answered this question differently. Locke has a very, very good answer right in front of Locke to answer this question with, because if you had all the limitless resources, you didn't have to abide by the format, you could do whatever you wanted to do, you could design an SCP in whatever way your fancy led you to, you would end up with SCP-6500,
more kind of shoot,
which is kind of like a video game. It's kind of, it has music that plays in the browser as you open it. It's got its own soundtrack, It's a video game that desperately is trying to claustrophobically fit into the SCP format. It does not do a good job of that.
Now, like type missions with like the Chaos Insurgency, or like clearing out infestations of stuff, just like different.
Another thing we could answer is Admonition Hub, which takes every design cue possible from Netflix and wants desperately to be Netflix when it grows up. And so that's what SCP would look like if you Netflixized it, is the Admonition Hub. And it's just about as, substanceless as well. Just desperation when it comes to the content.
Different game modes, to cover all the different facets of the Foundation.
No, but that's cool though. Like it's kind of like a
Cool, dude.
squad-based combat, but with like different
Cool story,
play
bro.
styles, because you know the breadth of like you're either fighting another group or like
Yeah, it'd be
containing
like
an anomaly
if you're
that.
Has an SCP game been made that isn't a first-person shooter? You know, Lobotomy Corporation is kind of an SCP game, and it's not first-person. But you know, I would love to see like a Age of Empires SCP style game where you have to like allocate resources in order to. I guess that's kind of what Lobotomy Corporation is. You basically allocate resources in order to contain things strategically. That would be nice.
Containing an anomaly would be more like puzzle based with how exactly
Yeah, I think-
you're supposed to contain it, because it might not just be something you can just like shoot
There
to
you
death,
go. There you go.
or like shoot to capture.
Yeah, like each one, like you'd have like different rules.
That's
I don't
basically
know.
Lobotomy Corporation is what they're describing now. That's really what happens. It's really what happens.
I don't know if D&D is like a good comparison with like how you have to be creative with like how you approach a threat.
Yeah, I don't know if that. Most
I mean,
of the
occasionally you
D&D
have to be
games,
creative. It depends on the
That's Lobotomy Corporation.
DM.
yeah, most of
It's a little more blind than just puzzling. There's sort of a random chance element in whether or not you're going to do well or not. But hey,
the DMs I've ran into usually result in I will stab you, or I will pull the shonen and stab you harder.
If I could
That
actually
depends.
write more for my campaign, I'd probably do that.
There is that we've always wanted to do that SCP tabletop.
No,
Is there an SCP tabletop? or am I
There is
thinking
an
of something else? There's a-
there
there's
is
some-
an SCP tabletop
There's
that
gotta
I
be.
found on Drive for RPG. There's also there's one that's like I can't remember what it's called. Jake showed it to me. It was like Point Green or something like that. That's basically just like an SCP tabletop, but it's like a lot more fleshed out.
I think I might be the only person in the history of the SCP who has never played a tabletop game. Never played D&D. That just wasn't me, man. Like in middle school and high school, I was like doing other things. I was in theater in high school. I don't know. Like I just never did D&D, and I can't help but be a little insecure about that, just in a little way, because it's almost like all the really good SCP authors were like D&D champions, you know, at some point in their life, and it's almost like a prerequisite to getting the degree of SCP a class I didn't take. So it's maybe I'm at a severe compositional and narrative disadvantage because I never did that. I don't know, but I think I'm the only one.
I'll have to ask him about it. But an SCP tabletop exists out on Drive Through RPG.
Yeah, there's a lot of games like that
that's
now.
pretty cool. It's SCP is now SCP isn't really ubiquitous now in internet culture, I guess, but it's gotten really popular lately, hasn't it? It feels like almost everybody that I talk to does.
Yeah, it really has. As popular as the SCP has always sort of been, it's always sort of been on an upward trajectory of mainstream exposure. It really has hit a new stride in the last year or so, and I think it's sort of coincided with the 5K. 5,000 got just a tremendous amount of exposure, and then you had things like the you don't recognize the bodies in the water sort of mimetic storm that happened around social media and TikTok and things like that. So I think that those were really exponents on the SCP Wiki, and I think it's more popular than it's ever been, which is really its own achievement. It's quite amazing, I will say, that is the case. However, there are, everything isn't as good as it seems. More money, more problems kind of thing. The grass is always greener. What I see in the SCP Wiki these days is that it's got way too much content coming in, to the point where it's really being, it's about to explode. It's got too much coming in. No one can keep up with the reading, which means that no one can properly curate the articles. And so, the quality standards and the curation process of the SCP Wiki has zero chance of maintaining pace, of covering appropriately the sheer amount of content that's coming into the SCP Wiki right now because of the popularity increase. So, I mean, this is a very, very clear case of success being its own failure. And the success of the SCP Wiki now, it's gotten to the point where it's too big to not fail. It's too big to succeed. It's gotten out of hand, and it's gotten out of control. And so SCP is, don't know what's going to happen to it, but, it's the spirit of SCP is still alive. There are some great articles still coming out of the SCP, but 90% of it is lost. 90% of it is depreciated. And it's a shame to see. How do you fix that? I don't know. One idea is that you limit how many SCPs can be posted in a given day, therefore how many can be posted in a given week. And the benefit of that is you increase the competition for resources. You make slot availability a little more scarce, a little more of a scarcity, because it's false to assume and to think and believe that slot numbers are a limited resource. They're not. It doesn't cost any data to add another 1,000 slots to the SCP Wiki site, and it doesn't really cost a lot of data to just maintain new SCP entries either. Functionally, there can be an infinite number of slots on the SCP Wiki. It's no matter how old it gets, it's never going to run into the problem of not having any more slots that it can create. So right now, as it stands, slot numbers on the SCP Wiki are not a scarcity. They are not a limited resource. And so that's one way you could try to attack the problem here. You could make the slots a little more competitive with a little more of a scarcity to people actually possessing those. And then, so in other words, you'd enact a sort of slow mode, in kind of like when you have a slow mode in the chat. You do that for the actual publication process of the SCP. That's one idea. The second idea is that you have difficulty adjustments. You have an algorithm that, depending upon how many people are present and trying to submit to the site, the standards for what is passable, that is to say, the minimum standards for the threshold of curation, increase. They get harder the more people who are attempting to get in. That way you retain the difficulty and thereby the standards. The problem with those two solutions is that the staff will never ever do that, because all they see are the numerical metrics. This is really the same demon that has plagued the SCP Wiki for a very long time. On the author side of things, it's the upvote totals and things like that. But on the staff side of things, which is just as dangerous and detrimental when it comes to mishandling and mismanaging the site into its ruin, which is what we're witnessing right now. On their side of it, it's that they see all the number of people that are active, all the registrations they get, the number of articles that are being submitted, the telescoping duration between, X contests, they'll see all those things, member count, they'll see all those things as definitive proof that the site has never been better. They are not reading the articles. They're not reading every article. They're not on the ground. They're not front line like I am, okay? So they don't know these things. All they see are the removed numerical reports, and because they want to, they take those to be definitive in their belief fixation that the SCP Wiki is richer and better than it's ever been, and that's just not true, not at all.
Maybe that's just where I frequent my social circles, though.
Possibly. It's becoming like a little more mainstream, like a little less niche over time.
Yeah, and some people don't like that. There was a lot of people when Containment Breach the game came out, they really resented the mainstream exposure of the SCP because, say what you want, but there's something correct about the side of the argument that would mourn the loss and those special qualities and elements that you get by keeping something underground, by keeping it to, relatively tight-knit, in a bunch of people who are there for the right reasons and not there because they want to sort of like mine social media points or social clout or social capital or whatever, praise, so there are people like, for example, the entirety of RPC basically is whether this is actually how they feel or it's just a consolation mechanism because they haven't had the success of SCP, they will tell you, most people at the RPC will tell you that they don't want to be popular. They don't want to have that sort of exposure. And so there's a fine line. You have to get some exposure because you want to survive. And if you don't, have some sort of marketability, some sort of exposure to a greater mainstream, if you don't exit the underground somehow a little bit, even, you'll die. You'll wither. So it's a It's definitely a difficult balance to achieve. I think RPC is on the more constrained side of that, a more constrained extreme, and SCP is certainly at a more liberally available extreme. In other words, RPC might be a little too chaste, and the SCP might be a little too promiscuous.
It's certainly not like, a incredibly popular like property or.
Yeah, I mean, there is like dedicated channels to SCP specifically. So I feel like, it's definitely something that people have an interest in. It's just one of those things that's like, you kind of have to be around that time when like Containment Breach released to like really know about it, because I feel like that's like most of the audience kind of knows about SCP either through like stumbling on a Volgun video, or they just grew up knowing that Markiplier or PewDiePie, whoever played that Containment Breach game and just kind of fell down that rabbit hole. I think another thing that I kind of want to ask is just like, is there really any like specific like, whether it be good or bad, interactions that you've had with the SCP community while we're on that topic?
Huh.
No, I mean,
So this is another answer that you don't answer. You know what I mean? Like, even if your answer is, well, yeah, I've had my issues with the SCP community, like, that's not something you say right here. Unless you're someone like me. See, that's my freedom. Come on, guys. Like, this is my freedom in being exiled, is that I can speak my mind. And that's actually what got me exiled, is speaking my mind. So it's a little backwards. But, people who are within the social circle of SCP, they're on a very tight leash, and they know that. They know that they are one wrong step, one wrong move away from being canceled. And part of the intimidation of being ostracized and unpersoned is a very, very large motivating factor at the SCP Wiki socially. It really informs, I would say, most of the interactions on the SCP Wiki. Not that you can't apologize and maybe survive it, but there certainly would be consequences if Locke decided to now air some dirty laundry.
pretty much pretty good interaction with most people. I don't get too caught up with interpersonal dramas or anything like that.
Is that true? I don't know. I frequently look at Locke's Twitter for SCP Meta. Excuse me. And I don't know if I can say that's a true statement or not.
So, I mean, my interactions are like just not very hard.
Just, what do you think, like, just to kind of wrap up everything on the SCP Foundation, what do you think sets the SCP Foundation apart from other horror works?
Good question.
I think it's just like it started like really kind of focused on these really short little tiny horror pieces, like, oh, here's a creepy item that kills you, but over time, like, it's just incorporated. You can find so many different types of content here. So I think like its real strength just lies in the variety of the community. The people dating it is just how open it is and put their work out there.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. Such a good answer. Because not a lot of people would like this. And I'm talking about people from like RPC specifically when I say this. A lot of people don't like the fact that the genre of containment fiction has matured to the point that you can write an SCP about anything. It doesn't have to be, obviously it doesn't have to be horror. Nobody thinks that SCP is pegged to horror, really. But it's gotten to the point, it's sophisticated enough of a medium to where you can really use it as a mapping device for anything. You can say anything you want to in any fashion in an SCP. You know, it's a very capable, very reliable medium. It's a very reliable genre, which is one of the reasons why it is a genre, is because you can really express anything you want to, abiding by the restrictions and the rules of it. And you have an infinitude of variety, which is what Locke is saying, within those rules and those restraints. And so that's what makes a genre. That's really what a genre is, right? There are things out there that don't have enough fertility and variety in them, given their rules and restraints, and those things you don't know about because they never survived to be a genre, because they didn't have that sweet spot of potentiality and clearly defined boundaries. Okay, so that's why containment fiction is a genre, and its maturity in the sense that it can approach any topic. You can write about any topic using the SCP format easily. Means that you will get SCPs of all kinds, including political articles. You know, one of the misconceptions that I think are out there about myself is that because I left SCP and because I wrote for RPC, that I don't think that articles should be political. Well, it's not really true. I definitely fault articles when it comes to how strong, how forward, and how aggressive they may be, essentially just being a megaphone for the author's idiosyncratic political beliefs. And I think there probably should be some tact involved in that process, just as a matter of good writing and as of dignified art. But, you know, I don't have a problem with political articles. In fact, I think some of my articles are political in nature. And I think it's important to have political articles. I think that, you know, why wouldn't you be able to express political things in the SCP format? That seems like a weird thing to restrict, to not include in the format. It's like the elephant graveyard of thought. You can't have political arguments. Like, that's its own form of censorship, by the way. That shouldn't happen. You should be able to write about political things. But you definitely should do it in a way to where people who don't necessarily agree with your political ideas aren't going to be cast as bigots or racists if they don't agree with you. And that's SCP Wiki's problem. It's hyper-politicized.
And be a part of the community.
In a partisan fashion.
Yeah, I mean, and you said, like, anyone can really join. Is there any, like, advice that you'd give to potential writers that are looking into getting to SCP or into horror maybe specifically? Because, I mean, you've got quite the repertoire. Figured maybe you would have some pretty solid advice for anyone that was curious about maybe taking a stab at making a draft at the least.
Honestly, the only and probably best advice is simply just to read, and yeah, it doesn't even have to be like SCPs in general. It could be anything. Watch things that you're in, and try to think about, like, you know, the content you like to consume. Like, what about it is it that you own, and, you know, think about how you could, you know, learn through observation and apply it to your own work.
I'll take that.
That's pretty solid advice.
Thanks.
Now, as I go ahead and burn SCP info-J, Phoenix, you had one last question that was on the SCP.
One second, everybody. What? I don't know. I asked you for water, though. Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Yeah. I meant water. Cookie's good. I can drink this. I can drink a cookie. All right, we're back. Thank you.
Yes. There's one entire, just important question that I've been dying to know ever since this interview.
Can't drink a cookie?
The suspense is killing me.
Got any games on your phone?
Probably Among Us.
No. Really? No. Shameful. All right, everybody. Well, that's a wrap for tonight. Thank you for listening. We're about 46 minutes in. And I'm gonna have to go process the fact that Locke has Among Us on the phone there. But appreciate you stopping by. So this will be the last reaction video we do this week. Once again, the next one will be on Tuesday. We'll have Tuesdays and Thursdays to do these, and so we'll pick up on Tuesday with this interview. And then tomorrow night, of course, I'm ready. I hope you're ready as well for the Gauntlet. I'm so excited. This week of SCPs has been less than impressive. This has been a subpar week for the SCP Wiki, so I'm going to try my best to not be negative, tomorrow, because a critic is only as good as they can be positive and only as good as they can praise. That's just how I look at it. So that's sometimes a challenge with the wiki, and that's certainly the case this week. But we do have all the articles that are going to be ready. There may be one more tonight, but we're looking at about, it's a lower number than usual too, surprisingly. Looks like about 15 articles to get through tomorrow, so we're looking at about 3 hours. But that starts at 7:30. Come check it out. If you've read the articles this week, I'd love to hear what you think about them. Share the link so that people can enjoy this. I think it's a service. I think it's a resource, because I know that people aren't reading all these articles. I know no one really has the time to read all of them, but for just a few. So this is obviously a nice summary. It's a nice tool. It's a nice heuristic. So share the link around if you think people will like it. And I thank you so much for joining again. It is always a pleasure to be here and to talk about these things with you, which I just love doing. So this has been SCPCRNP, aka Lack of Lepers, and I will see you tomorrow for the Weekend Collapsible. Take it easy. Catch you next time.